What's your I don't believe in ghosts, but that was really weird story part 2. Please remember to like, share, and subscribe. My brother passed away in 2008. Fast forward to 2016. I was asleep, and I had a dream about him, as I often did since he passed away. This dream was different. It was like he was talking directly to me, looking straight in my eyes. In the dream I asked him, "Is it really you?" He said, "Yes." I said, "Prove it." He then reached out and touched me on the arm, and when he did, I jolted up in bed wide awake, covered in sweat. I thought all this was really strange, and I went to the bathroom to put some water on my face. As I was looking in the mirror, I saw that there was a backwards R written on my arm in pen exactly where he touched me in the dream. The letter R was the first letter of his name. There were no pens in my bedroom, and I've never sleepwalked before. You can call me crazy or lying or whatever, but that was the single most unexplainable thing that has ever happened to me. My mom passed away in July 2020, and I rarely have dreams about her. I've had only a few, and I'll usually ask her to come to a dream. Last spring, I had a dream I was on the phone with her and walking around a flower garden. I was telling her about things happening in my life, and she was telling me about what was happening for her wherever she is. It was time to get off the phone, and she said she'd see me soon, so I asked her when. She said September 28th. I was surprised and said, "This September 28th? That seems so soon." In my head thinking she'd coming back to life, dream logic. She said, "No, September 28th, 2031. And we hung up and I woke up. This dream was months ago, but I can't shake it. It feels like she told me when I'm dying. I'm staying home all day on 9/28/31. Good luck. Back in like 2009, I used to have a Game Boy and the camera game cartridge, and I would go around my house just goofing off, and I'd show my grandpa all the pictures, and as he was looking through them, he randomly stops and is in a dead stare at one of the photos, and when he showed me this picture, it was a picture of my great uncle, deceased since before my birth, standing beside one of my grandpa's nightstands. I was never so freaked out, because at the time, we shared a room. Back in 2008, one of my colleagues got killed in a car accident. The next morning, I was sitting at my station when the boss came walking down the hallway with tears in her eyes. I knew something terrible had happened, and the second she told me Ben had been killed, I felt a breeze behind me. So I turned to look and see what it was, and I saw him standing there in another hallway, smiling at me, like everything was just fine. I was left with a most chilling feeling in my gut. I still miss him dearly. When I was younger, my dad used to live in an old barn conversion out in the countryside near Leeds. I'd go round to stay there usually one night every weekend and occasionally during the week. My room was upstairs, sort of an attic room with a skylight and a big wooden beam that ran through the center. The house had been the barn for the farm next door. The woman who owned the farm still lived next door. It wasn't really a working farm anymore, but they bred Cocker Spaniel puppies there. My dad got a couple of spaniels from there over the years, so they were pretty friendly. I never really felt comfortable in that room. It was cold and drafty, and since I only stayed there once or twice a week, I never really got round to decorating it in any way. Whenever I slept in there, I would sleep badly. I'm not prone to bad dreams generally, but almost every time I slept in there, I would have vivid nightmares. I would always wake up from these nightmares at around 3 a.m. and usually exactly at 3 a.m. I remember that after a few years of staying there, I would wake up from these dreams and know it would be 3 a.m. before I rolled over to look at the clock in my bed. It had really just become an annoyance. Later on, I found out that 3 a.m. was supposed to be the real witching hour, and suddenly it all seemed a bit more spooky, although that might just be a line from a movie. I would often hear odd sounds through the night, like someone walking on the roof in heavy boots. The other sound I often heard was like random tapping on the skylight. It sounded like short periods of heavy rain on the skylight, which I tended to assume this was, being pretty typical for Yorkshire. But on a couple of occasions when this happened, I checked the weather and it was clear and dry outside. I mentioned the noises to my dad. He said it was probably just birds on the roof. I never did see any birds up there though. I was glad when my dad finally decided to move out of that place. I was having a drink with him a couple of years ago, and he was talking about how he thought the place was haunted. He'd had a few weird things happen there himself. I mentioned my room, and he told me that he agreed that it was spooky, and that he'd once come back home and found the skylight wide open. Nobody had been in all day, and it was usually locked, too heavy for the wind to have blown open. He also decided that now he felt comfortable to tell me the story behind the house. Apparently, the woman next door had sold the barn to be turned into housing because her husband had killed himself there. She awoke one morning to find him hanging from the beam up in the roof, the beam that ran through my room. I'm not sure if my imagination is embellishing this story a little here, but I seem to recall being told that he had come in from the fields on a rainy night to do it, and they had found him there still wearing his soaking raincoat and muddy boots, which might explain some of the noises I used to hear. Needless to say, I was glad he waited until he moved out before telling me all that. It was hard enough to sleep there when I just thought it was cold. I live in an old farmhouse in upstate New York. I've had about 5 dreams now that where my mom comes into my room and sits on my dad and we have a conversation. I don't remember the details of the convo, but it feels real. My mom and twin sister died during childbirth. Never got to meet her. I know it's her through pictures, Facebook videos, and voicemails. They're not scary. I like them. I always wake up and look around swearing it must have been real. We were shooting a short film at a museum that used to be a prison, very old prison. It was finished in 1904. The entire complex is enclosed by 2 tall walls, and it's surrounded by a very old part of the town. It isn't abandoned, but is very quiet around. Very few cars pass by. So we were doing this very small shot, an insert, just the DP, the director, and the actress. The rest of us were watching silently from a distance. We're a very small crew. Not more than 7 or 8 people. At this point, we're in the zone that wasn't remodeled at the time, so there's dirty bathrooms, showers, and cells around us. We're waiting for the shot to be over when suddenly I hear a baby cry, just a whine. I look up to my girlfriend at the time and she looks at me like I heard it too. The director says, "Cut." Then the sound gaffer asks, "Did anybody hear the baby?" "You recorded it?" we ask him, but he said no. The shot was going to be replaced with other mix of sound anyway. But he heard the cry through the headphones and the recorder. We did a quick search around the zone, but we didn't find anything, not even a cat. When the cry, the sound sometimes is like a baby. Long story short, we heard the cry of a baby at an abandoned prison. Lived in this big old house around 10 years ago, getting my daughter ready for school one day. We couldn't find any of her coats, searched the full house. I wrapped my coat around her, took her to school, went and bought her a new one. We headed home, opened the door, and 4 of her coats were hanging on the banister rail. We checked there before we left. It was definitely empty. A few dodgy things happened there. Was glad to move out. Was up watching Netflix super late one night when I heard glass shatter somewhere in my house. All 3 cats that were on my bed at the time, no other animals in the house, heard it and started acting crazy. I searched the entire house and nothing broken, knocked over, or out of place. Texted all the roommates. No one heard anything. Went back into my room, and no joke, within the next 30 seconds to a minute, I saw 7 huge spiders run across the floor randomly and in different directions. I lived in the basement, but had never seen that many spiders in even a couple days, let alone less than a minute. It really weirded me out. This actually happened last week. I was helping my dad out with his work. He's an architect. We were visiting a site, and it was quite possibly the weirdest house I've ever seen. Massive rooms leading into random corridors with no rooms off it. Rooms inside rooms. One of them had an incinerator in. There were 4 rooms labeled church with holes in the floor that led to nowhere. I think in total there was around 50 to 70 rooms, 10 of which were bathrooms. It was weird as F. I immediately thought of the Winchester house in San Jose, but I didn't say anything. When we got upstairs and went into another random room, this time with painted on windows, like literally painted on, there weren't any windows. On the wall was written Winchester in red pen. This freaked me the F out, as I know for a fact the place was occupied until very recently, and there's no way anyone could have gotten in. So obviously, I took a photo because I wanted to tell my true crime obsessed friend later. It was freaky. So when I was in high school and had to go to dance team practice stupid early, my dad would get up and drive me there. I remember I was at the bottom of the steps of our dimly lit house waiting for my dad to come down. I saw the figure of a man at the top of the steps for like a second and thought it was my dad. That's when my dad said, "Are you ready to go?" and I saw him standing at the front door looking at me. Obviously, I looked at the top of the steps again, and it was gone. This was also around the time my aunt was visiting from a different country and had told us that she has a figure that follows her and watches her as she sleeps. Apparently, she saw him at our house, in my room that she was staying in. My dad and I haven't spoken for 3 years before he died. A few days before I lost my dad from heart attack, I was complaining about a lighter I gifted him and saying I bet he threw it away or gave it to someone. But when I went to his house after he died, a button off my coat fell off in a really weird way, and when I was searching for thread and needle, I found a little box inside the cookie box where the needles and threads are, and the lighter was inside this little box. I work at a school, and there has been a long joke about a ghost at the school. Numerous items will go missing and reappear in odd places or the exact same place sometimes. Of course, this could be just somebody grabbing something from a room and putting it back, so we just joked when this happened that it was a ghost. However, we had 3 events happen to 3 separate teachers in the same classroom within the course of a month. The first incident was a teacher and 1 student were in the room. He was talking with the boy at the front of the class when they heard a sound from the back of the room. They both turned to look to see a chair basically turn 90 degrees. They both looked at each other, and the teacher asked the student if they saw it too. He did, and they just stared at each other. Cut to a different teacher in that room at the end of the day a few weeks later. He was the last teacher in that part of the school, so he had to lock up all the rooms. He was in the haunted room and found some materials from the next classroom. He went to that room and put them back when he heard a bang from the haunted room, and when he went back, one of the chairs was laying on the ground, while the rest were pushed into the desks. He swore that they were all pushed in before he left. Both things are explainable by things like strong drafts or school setting at night, maybe even minor tremors or something. However, the final nail in the coffin on this was one of the students from that was taught in that room stopped coming for a short time. They weren't there for 3 days in a row. When the regular class teacher phoned her family to find out if she was ill or what was told, the absent student saw a girl with half a face in the room and has been too terrified to come to class. This was all last year. Since then, there hasn't been anything too odd, or at least nobody has told the rest of us anything odd happening in that one room. We had all gathered in my grandmother's house on the day of her funeral. It was in December, but when I looked out the window, I noticed a rose had bloomed on a bush in her backyard. My father brought it in and put it in a vase on the kitchen table. We all left the house and went to the funeral. When we returned, the rose was laying on the living room floor. My father is very hard-headed and skeptical, but he is convinced that his mother was trying to tell him that she was okay. My firstborn child and I were in the midst of a month-long battle of wills about where he should sleep. I was valiantly trying to get him to sleep in his crib. He was even more insistent he could only sleep wrapped around Mama. One night, I wake up around 11 or so to hear my son crying in his room. My husband is not in bed with me, and I assume he is still awake. Just as I'm about to get up, I hear someone whisper over the baby monitor, saying my son's name and making the sort of soothing hushing noises one makes to a crying baby. The crying reduces to the occasional whimper, and I think, "Yay, Daddy has got this one," as I lay back down. A few minutes later, the crying ramps up again, so I call to my husband to just bring me the baby. No response from my husband. More crying from the baby. I try again. Same thing. Now I'm super annoyed that my husband is being stubborn, and clearly none of us are going back to sleep until I nurse the baby. So I get up and head to the baby's room. The second I step into the hallway, I hear my husband snoring. He's out cold in the guest room and has clearly not been shushing our son in his nursery. I snatched my now hysterical baby out of his crib and hightailed it to my room for the night. I also unplugged the baby monitor. Of note, this was 2011 and a cheap baby monitor. It was the older radio style, not internet capable. Also, we live in a fairly spread out suburban neighborhood and had never picked up any sort of interference before. A friend of mine was working overnight at a prison, just sat on a wing. This place had single occupancy cells. One of the prisoners was out at hospital overnight, very late. The call bell went off. He checked the cell number and canceled the call, as it was the cell belonging to the guy out at the hospital. He figured it was an electrical fault, not unusual, Shortly after the phone rang, the prisoner had died. My sister every few years will hear our deceased great-aunt's voice giving her some family news. Every time it has happened, we find out in a few months that the information is true. Last time it was about a cousin's pregnancy. We found out 3 months later when my aunt, cousin's mom, confirmed it, which meant the message came right around conception, i.e., no way my sister could have known about the pregnancy. When I was about 9 or 10, I was playing with my dog and her puppies in our living room when I heard the voice of an old woman say, "Apoko," translate to "my grandchild." It felt like if someone were to speak right beside your ear, it was that loud and clear. Back then, my grandma didn't live with us, so I don't know who could that be, but it sure sounded like an old woman. Still gives me goosebumps when I think about it. That magical moment, I got the phone call telling me that my grandfather just died. The 4th of July fireworks show began in an epic proportion. I had just moved to a small town and had no idea about the show and was alone in my backyard. It happened just around the corner, so the fireworks were very close and filled the sky. It was a very poetic moment for me and my grandfather's memory.